If we go back for a second for trade-offs, right? So when you build a blockchain, what essentially you're doing is you're making an inefficient database. And it's a database that has the unique capability that it can be stored in anyone's personal device around the world. And that comes with advantages, mainly decentralization. But it also comes with tons of trade-offs because if you're going to have thousands or millions of people store your database, it has to be tiny, it has to be low bandwidth. And so it has to be this really small and tight database. And the more you try to add features to that or add throughput to that, you're sacrificing some degree of decentralization. And so there's that trade-off there. So Bitcoin is built like a cockroach in that space. It's basically fully optimized for as much decentralization as possible and is willing to sacrifice other variables. And that's what gives it that sound money quality. Back in 2017 in the block size war, 80% of the hash rate, the largest maker of Bitcoin miners, which was almost a monopoly, the largest exchanges and custodians, and some of the earlier developers all teamed up and they wanted to change Bitcoin's block size and they couldn't do it. And so it was basically because of that distributed node network, because of that decentralization, it's almost impossible to change without utterly massive consensus to change something. And even then, when it changes, with for example, this upcoming Taproot soft fork, it changes through soft forks, rather than hard forks. And so Bitcoin, in that sense, is something that I consider to be sound money at this point. Whereas when you go into other cryptos, I think it's on one hand, if they're fully transparent with what they're doing, and they're basically acknowledging the trade-offs that they're making, there's certainly experimentation to be had here. And even, for example, some of the things started on Ethereum end up going onto Bitcoin DeFi as well. So there's innovation in the space. The challenge that we run into in those other projects is that by expanding complexity on the base layer, they sacrifice some degree of decentralization. And there's a spectrum there. And so with, say, Ethereum, obviously you put smart contracts into the base layer. So one issue is, so you have a lot more features. You can do a lot more with it. You can do DeFi, you can do stable coins, you can do NFTs, whereas Bitcoin can only do that with additional layers put on top of it. So that's a whole different design philosophy. Whereas with Ethereum, you can do all in the base layer. The downside is, so in order to do all these changes, and they kind of, their culture is based around changes and iteration and improvement, they put, for example, difficulty bombs in the code. And so they change through hard forks rather than soft forks. So it kind of takes away a lot of the power of the nodes. And in addition, the block size grows so much faster than Bitcoin's does, where in a few years, you're going to need multiple terabytes of data if you want to be able to validate the entire blockchain. And it's harder to sync it. And then they're going to go to proof of stake and just change that system. And so there's more centralization risk there. And then we get into another project. That's kind of if you see the Bitcoins and the Ethereums arguing with each other, it's often about decentralization and risk and things like that. Then if you get into something like Solana, where you have a proof of stake smart contract chain, it has a lot more throughput than Ethereum, so a lot cheaper fees, but it comes with even more centralization. So you often see the Ethereans criticize Solana for being too centralized. And they, as an example of how centralized Solana is, they still do manual slashing. So proof of stake works on slashing, meaning that, if a proof of work miner verifies the wrong blockchain, their punishment is simply that they mine blocks that don't make it into the main chain. Therefore, they wasted real world resources. And that's their own punishment. Whereas in a proof of stake, because you're not using real resources to validate, you're using your tokens, you have to get some of your tokens taken away if you vote for the wrong chain. And Solana still has manual slashing. So it's not even a fully automated blockchain. The developers still essentially have complete control over it at the end of the day. And we saw, a couple months ago, it went down for 17 hours, the entire blockchain, and had to be manually, they had to talk and manually restart it at the validators. And so there's a spectrum of decentralization there. And so I put Bitcoin in one bucket, and all the others are kind of these experimental tech equities. And so it's two very different types of investments. It's kind of like comparing, like a startup company with no profit yet that's kind of getting an idea off the ground versus an established business, right? So it's two very different ways of looking at it. But then another thing I do is that I separate price action from fundamentals. So for example, in my research service, I would talk about these issues with Ethereum, but then say, I think for the next year it's going a lot higher, right? So, and I would talk about some of the supply squeezes that are happening with it. I basically, once it broke over 1,400 back in like January or February, that's when I became quite bullish on Ethereum along with Bitcoin in my service and in terms of price.
Before we continue, help us clicking that YouTube like button and subscribe now to our channel. This shows the algorithm that you valued this information. And it helps us spread that message. Sharing is caring. And now, let's continue.
I have bad news for you. If you're not rich by now, you're screwed. And if you're in debt, you're even double screwed. How so, you might wonder? Well, the sad truth is that you're working your whole life to make someone else rich. The mega corporations, the banks, the politicians, everyone is getting richer. They get your money. And what is even worse, they get your time, they get your life. You are not even in a rat race, you're in a financial prison. But what could a solution for you look like? Honestly, I don't know, but I know what a solution for me would look like. It's very simple. I use whatever money I have and I multiply it with 1,000. This could make my life much easier and probably yours as well. If you have $1,000 available and multiply this with 1,000, I believe that this could solve some financial issue for the one or the other. Of course, if you're ugly, you would have to multiply it with much more than 1,000. My name is Markus Dahn, and this is what I decided to do. I decided to 1000x my money. This is not a joke. I know what you may be thinking. What is this guy talking about? How should this work? This is not possible. Well, I made a detailed video where I laid out my plan. And some clever folks might even want to look at this plan and copy it and do exactly what I do. This is just a little hint on the side. You have two options. You leave, you forget what you have seen. You do whatever you're doing and you hope that somehow you get some other results. Good luck with that. Or you click the link below the video. You enter your email address because I'm not showing this to everybody. You at least watch my video on how I plan to 1000x my money. The choice is yours. Make the right choice. Join me. See what a different future you could have. See at least how I intend, how I plan to do the 1000x. So click on the link below, enter your email address, and I see you on the other side. Your Markus Dahn.